in a place where the trees are so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. The quiet of nature hides secrets that time wants to keep. The Ozarks in the middle of Missouri have always been a place where stories are told in whispers, where legends are born in bars and die in confessionals. But out of all the stories that have been passed down through the years, none is as dark as the one about two women who were related by blood and had a reputation that didn't make sense at the time. In 1908, Lily and Lucy came to Webster County from a place that no one could find. They didn't talk about their past or their family, and they didn't bring letters or pictures that might have shown where they came from. They were just two identical shapes that looked like smoke among the hills. They settled on an empty lot on the edge of a small community that didn't even deserve to be called a village. The house they picked was in a remote area, surrounded by acres of thick forest, and could only be reached by a dirt road that became impassable during the spring rains. At first, it made sense that the neighbors were curious. In that conservative area, it was rare for single women to live alone without a man to protect or provide for them. But Lily and Lucy didn't need protection or food. They grew their own food, raised chickens, kept a beautiful vegetable garden, and, most interestingly, had money that no one could explain. They paid their bills in cash, bought supplies without thinking about the cost, and wore clothes that were simple, but made of fabric that was too thin for women who were said to live off the land. In the first few months, the locals tried to get in touch. They brought freshly baked pies, offered to help fix fences, and asked the twins to come to church with them on Sundays. People were polite but cold to all of their attempts. They smiled but didn't look them in the eye, thanked them nicely, and then closed the door. Lily and Lucy didn't want to be part of that community. They just wanted to live on the edges, watching without being watched and living without being questioned. But in a small village, mystery quickly turns into distrust, and when distrust isn't answered, it becomes something much worse. The whispers started out slowly. Why would two identical women choose to live alone? What did they do at night when the windows lit up with faint lights until the early morning? Why didn't anyone ever see them together in the city? They always seemed to be there one at a time, like they were on different shifts in an invisible vigil. Theories grew like weeds. Some people said they were war widows who couldn't live with anyone else because they were too traumatized. Some people thought they were running away from a scandal in the East, maybe a broken marriage or a fight over an inheritance. Some people said they saw them talking to each other in the woods, laughing at jokes that no one else could hear, and moving in such perfect harmony that they looked like they were reflections of each other. Then came the darker stories, the ones that were only told after the third glass of whiskey, when fear of the unknown took over, and reason gave way to imagination. A merchant said he saw one of them bring a heavy sack into the house at night, which moved and made a muffled sound. A boy said that he saw clothes stained with dark dirt being burned in the yard during the day, as if the people doing it didn't care at all about hiding it. A farmer said that his hunting dog, which was trained to follow any trail, wouldn't cross the twins' property line. It howled and ran away with its fur standing on end, as if it could sense something that humans couldn't. What really happened in that house between the trees? What were Lily and Lucy so careful about? And why, even though everyone was suspicious, did no one have the guts to confront them directly? The answers to these questions would come slowly, like fog rising from the valley at dawn and revealing a truth that no one was ready to face. The trip had just begun, and what happened next would test everything they thought they knew about the limits of human nature. The change from curiosity to paranoia happened slowly, like how rust eats away at metal that is always wet. In the winter of 1909, blizzards cut off the area for weeks. When spring finally melted the ice on the roads, the air felt different. People started to see patterns instead of just coincidences. They started to connect dots that maybe shouldn't have been connected. Travelers were at the center of everything. The Ozarks have always been a place where people pass through on their way to new beginnings in the West, for merchants moving goods between far-off villages, and for itinerant preachers bringing the word of God to Missouri's most remote areas. One side of the road that went through Webster County was a cliff, and the other side was a forest that couldn't be seen through. People often got lost at night. Wagons broke axles on the uneven stones, and horses stumbled, hurting their riders and making them lose their way. Lily and Lucy's property was on a bend in the road, where it could be seen by people passing by, but was also private enough that no one could see it. This visibility is what started to draw attention. Some villagers noticed that some travelers who should have gone through the area never made it to their next stop. A merchant, who had promised to bring spices to a family 3 days away, never showed up. A man who said he was going to see his brother in the next county was never seen again. A woman looking for work as a governess on a farm to the south seemed to have disappeared between one village and the next. These were isolated events that happened months apart and were easy to explain by the area's natural dangers. Wild animals lived in the woods. Bandits sometimes attacked people who were alone, and the rough terrain caused deadly accidents. People wouldn't have thought twice about these events if it hadn't been for a strange detail that started to come up in tavern conversations. Several of these people had last been seen near that remote house. A blacksmith remembered fixing a cartwheel for a traveling salesman who said he would stop at the twins' place to get water before continuing on his way. That salesman never made it to the next town. A seamstress remembered a traveler who had asked for directions and talked about 2 identical women she had seen working in the garden. That traveler also disappeared from everyone's memory, as if they had never existed. A pastor told the story of how he blessed a young preacher who was going to preach in every house along the way. The young man never came back to say how many souls he had saved, but no one knew how to connect suspicions to evidence. The twins stuck to their strict schedule, only going to the village when they had to, and always one at a time, being polite and quiet. They paid in cash, bought some basic things, talked for a minute, and then left. Being antisocial wasn't against the law. There was nothing wrong with wanting to be alone. And there was definitely no law that could put someone in jail just because of strange coincidences and theories based on fear. William Thorne was the county sheriff. He was a practical man who had fought in a war and learned to only trust what he could see and touch. When he heard the rumors in 1910, he first thought they were just a lot of people going crazy. When women broke social norms, small towns always made up big stories about them. He had a lot of logical reasons for why travelers changed their plans, didn't finish their trips, or just moved to a new place without telling anyone. But the reports kept coming, and they bothered him. It wasn't the number of cases, which was actually small over 2 years, but the details of the connections. Everyone mentioned had been on that stretch of road, seen near that property, and never confirmed at their intended destination. 1 or 2 cases could be explained by coincidence, maybe even 3. But when the number reached 5 or 6 people over the course of 24 months, the coincidence started to look like a pattern. Thorne chose to go on an unofficial visit. It wasn't an official investigation. It was just a friendly conversation between a law enforcement officer and county residents. On a clear May afternoon, he rode to the property and thought about how to talk to the person without sounding like he was accusing them. He made questions that seemed casual but could show inconsistencies. He was going to look at the house and the area around it to see if there were any signs of something wrong that would require a more thorough inspection. What he found was completely different from what he had expected. The property was kept in perfect condition. The garden was full of vegetables that were perfectly arranged in rows. In a well-built pen, chickens pecked peacefully. The house was small, but it was in great shape. The windows were clean and the paint was fresh, which made the afternoon sun shine through them. The place didn't look bad at all. In fact, It looked nothing like the dark den that rumors said it was. Lily smiled at him from the balcony in a polite but distant way. She wore a plain blue cotton dress, had clean hands, and her hair was tied back in a useful bun. Her eyes were a light brown color that looked clear in the light, and her voice had a sweet tone that didn't match the coldness of her face. She offered him tea, which Thorne accepted more out of politeness than desire. She also answered all of his questions with careful accuracy. No, they hadn't seen any travelers in trouble. No, they didn't usually talk to people who walked by on the road. Yes, sometimes people would stop to ask for directions or water, but that was rare and always quick. No, they didn't know about any missing people in the area. They lived alone to stay away from the problems that come with being too close to strangers. Someone who knew exactly what to say picked each word carefully, and each answer made sense. Thorne left the property without any proof of wrongdoing, but he had a bad feeling in his stomach that he couldn't explain. It wasn't really fear or clear suspicion. It was something more subtle, like an instinctive feeling that there were layers to that conversation that he couldn't get to, that behind those clear eyes there was something that wanted to stay hidden. He got on his horse and rode back to the village. He only looked back once and saw Lily still standing on the porch, watching him leave with a smile that didn't show any real emotion. The next few months were deceptively calm, like the eerie quiet that comes before a big storm. The sheriff's visit seemed to have calmed the villagers down. They went from being suspicious to being embarrassed that they had made up stories about two women who just wanted to be left alone. People in the tavern stopped talking about their gloomy theories and started making fun of themselves for how boring life in the country could be, turning coincidences into conspiracies. The seasons and the work on the land set the pace of life again. But in the Ozarks, where the trees hold echoes older than any human memory, some truths refused to stay hidden. In the fall of 1910, the leaves turned rust and gold, and with it came an event that would bring all of the old suspicions back to life, this time with an intensity that couldn't be ignored. Harold Brennan, a fabric merchant, was driving through the area from St. Louis. He was loading his cart with rolls of linen, silk, and cotton that he planned to sell in the villages along the river. People knew Harold was friendly because he would stop to talk to people, share news from the big cities, and make friends who would become loyal customers. He had promised his wife that he would come back before the first snow and bring enough money for them to have a warm winter. He also promised that this time he wouldn't let alcohol eat up his profits. Harold never came back home. 3 weeks later, his wagon was found turned over in a ravine half a mile from the twins' house. The horses were gone, probably because they ran away after the crash. There were rolls of fabric all over the hillside. Some were torn by branches, and others were wet from the rain that had been falling nonstop for days. There was no sign of Harold himself, no blood to show that he was hurt badly, and no footprints to show where he might have gone to get help. Sheriff Thorne set up a 4-day search. Men from the village and nearby counties searched the forest in groups, calling Harold's name until they were hoarse. They looked into every cave and ravine in the area's unique rock formations. They only heard silence. The forest had completely taken over Harold Brennan, as if he had never existed outside of that old wagon and those worn-out clothes. Someone suggested looking at the twins' property while they were looking for something. A young farmer named Thomas came up with the idea, but as soon as he saw the disapproving looks from the others, he wished he hadn't. But once the idea was in their heads, they couldn't ignore it. Thorne knew he couldn't legally search the house without proof of a crime, but he also knew that if he didn't at least ask a few questions, his conscience would bother him. It was either Lucy or Lily who answered the door this time. It's hard to say for sure. She had flour in her hands and an apron over her dress. The smell of fresh bread came from inside the house. When she saw the sheriff and 3 armed men behind him, she didn't look surprised or scared. She just looked a little annoyed, as if they were interrupting a recipe at a bad time. No, she hadn't seen any traders. No, she hadn't heard of any accidents on the road. Yes, she and her sister were home that week, getting ready for winter by preserving food and making the windows stronger against the cold. No, the men could look around the property as long as they didn't scare the chickens or walk on the vegetable garden. She spoke with the same unsettling calm that Lily had shown months before, with every word and pause carefully chosen. The men looked in the barn, the chicken coop, the well, and the fields around them. They didn't find anything strange for a well-kept rural property. Tools neatly arranged, hay stored for the winter, a few sacks of grain, and firewood cut and stacked with almost obsessive care. Everything was where it should be, and everything made sense. The only thing that didn't was the nagging feeling that something was fundamentally wrong, a discord that none of them could put into words, but that they all felt like a weight on their chests. Thorne asked if he could come in, and Lucy graciously nodded, like a hostess welcoming guests to dinner. The inside was surprisingly inviting, with well-kept, simple furniture, a clean fireplace where firewood crackled softly, and shelves full of books, from novels to agricultural treatises. The kitchen smelled like bread and herbs, and there were jars of preserves neatly arranged in the pantry. There were 2 narrow beds in separate rooms, and each one was perfectly made. There was no cellar, just a trapdoor that led to a small storage area where vegetables stayed fresh during the summer. In short, there was nothing that could be used against them. There is no proof of violence, no items belonging to missing travelers, and no leads that would support any legal action. Thorne thanked them for their help, said he was sorry for the intrusion, and left the property with his men. They all felt the same uneasy silence that words couldn't fully describe. The failed search in the village split people into 2 groups. Some people said that the twins were obviously innocent, and that they were being treated unfairly because they were different and didn't follow the rules about how women should live. Some people became more sure that something bad was going on. They said that the lack of evidence was suspicious in and of itself, and that people who were so well organized would know how to keep secrets they didn't want to share. That year, winter came with a vengeance, bringing blizzards that closed roads and cut off communities for weeks. Lily and Lucy stayed on their property during those white, quiet months. Smoke rose steadily from their chimney, and light flickered in their windows every night. No one saw or heard them, and no one would risk walking through the deep snow to see if they were okay. They were only a distant presence, like 2 identical shadows living on the line between the known world and something no one wanted to name. In 1911, when spring finally melted the ice, it revealed more than just land that was ready to wake up. It also showed that the twin story was far from over, and that the most disturbing part was still to come. It was written on the land itself, in places where time can only reveal the secrets of the Ozarks. Not only did spring wake up nature, but it also brought with it a restlessness that seemed to come from the ground itself in the Ozarks. People started to notice small changes in the twins' behavior, little things that were different from their carefully planned routine. Individually, these changes didn't mean much, but together they made a strange picture. Lily and Lucy had always gone to the village one at a time, never together, as if one of them always had to stay behind to guard the property. But now, they both started to show up at the same time, walking side by side down the main street in a way that seemed almost supernatural. Their steps were the same, their movements were the same, and even the way they turned their heads to look at something happening was perfectly in sync. It was like seeing one person twice, a reflection that had come to life and was walking next to the real person. The shopkeepers who talked to them said that their conversations were strange because one person would start a sentence and the other would finish it. They always talked about themselves in the singular, even when both were there. It was as if they could share thoughts without saying a word. The butcher swore that he had asked Lily which cut of meat she wanted, and Lucy had answered before her sister even opened her mouth. It was as if they had rehearsed every conversation, or, even stranger, as if they were really one mind living in two bodies. But these strange behaviors were just the tip of the iceberg of something deeper that was starting to show itself. In May of that year, Robert, a farmer whose land was next to the twins, found something strange while fixing fences on his property. There was a small, makeshift cemetery among the trees, partly hidden by bushes. There were 7 crosses made of branches tied together with ropes that marked what looked like animal graves. Robert couldn't figure out what the symbols on each cross meant. It would have been easy to say that the twins buried chickens or other farm animals that died naturally there, but the way those crosses were arranged, in a way that looked almost ceremonial, made it seem like there was more to it than just getting rid of dead animals. They made a perfect semicircle, all the same height and facing the same way, as if the person who put them there was following a specific ritual. Robert brought up the discovery in passing during dinner at a neighbor's house, hoping that someone would give him a good reason to feel better. Instead, his comment sparked a flood of similar stories that had been kept quiet out of fear of looking foolish or superstitious. One woman said that her chickens stopped laying eggs after they started scratching near the twins' property line. A hunter said that his tracking dogs wouldn't follow trails that took them too close to that land, even when the scent of game was strong and clear. The testimony of a lumberjack who worked in the nearby forests was even more troubling. He said he had heard women singing in perfect harmony on new moon nights, singing songs that weren't religious hymns and using words he didn't understand that made his blood run cold. He said the sound was both beautiful and scary, like angels and demons had learned to sing together. Sheriff Thorne got more and more angry as he listened to these stories. He was a man of hard evidence, written laws, and set ways of doing things. Putting up crosses on private property was not against the law. There was no law against singing at night. There were many practical reasons why hens stopped laying eggs. Dogs that are scared could be reacting to predators or just to smells that are new to them. There was nothing he could do legally. There was no reason for an official investigation, and he couldn't get a warrant based on superstition and chance. But the community was putting more and more pressure on them, like water behind a dam that was about to break. People wanted to know what was going on. They wanted someone in charge to do something, anything, to get rid of the fear that had settled over their lives like a thick fog. Some people stopped using that stretch of road altogether, and chose to take long, expensive detours instead of going near the twins' property. Some people talked openly about getting together to kick Lily and Lucy out of the county, even if they had to use force. It was in this tense setting that the event that would change everything took place. A merchant who was just passing through and had no idea about the problems in the area stopped by the twins' house to ask for water for his horses. People were polite to him, as they usually are. They also gave him a glass of water and a few minutes of rest in the shade. He agreed, thankful for the kindness on a very hot day in June. What he saw in those short minutes would stay in his memory forever, with a clarity that would never fade. While Lucy got water from the well, Lily stayed with him on the porch and made small talk about the weather and the state of the roads. But then, in a moment that felt like it would never end, the merchant saw something that made no sense at all. Lucy came back with the bucket of water, and when she and Lily looked at each other, their faces changed at the same time. There wasn't a scary change. It was something much more subtle, and that's what made it so much more disturbing. It was like a mask had been taken off for a moment, showing something behind it that wasn't quite human. Not in a supernatural way, but in the sense that something that should be there was missing. Empathy, maybe, or the ability to really connect with another person. The merchant quickly drank his water, thanked them in a shaky voice, and left in a hurry, which was strange for someone who had just seemed tired. He went to the nearest tavern in the next village and drank until he felt brave enough to tell someone what had happened. His description was vague, and he stumbled over his words as he tried to explain something he didn't fully understand. But the fear in his eyes was real, and impossible to fake. The story spread quickly, and with each telling, it got more and more detailed, turning from an unsettling observation into a story of supernatural horror. When it got to Sheriff Thorne, it had turned into a story about twins possessed by evil spirits, dark pacts sealed with animal sacrifices, and a curse that would spread across the area if nothing was done. Thorne knew he had lost control of things. People were no longer thinking clearly. Instead, they were all panicking together. In small villages, this kind of panic could lead to mob violence. He had to do something, not because he believed the stories, but because he had to restore order before someone got hurt, before scared citizens took justice into their own hands, and before the worst, which had only been hinted at and suspected until then, became real. Thorne's choice was to face the twins one last time, not with vague accusations or bar gossip, but with the full power of someone who represented the law in Webster County. He thought carefully about how to do it. He chose a clear July afternoon in 1911 and only brought his deputy, a calm man named James who also preferred facts to fantasies. They rode to the property together, determined like men who had made a choice they couldn't change. What they saw was a peaceful scene from the countryside that was almost too normal to be real. One of the twins was pulling weeds while the other watered rows of vegetables that were growing very well. They wore straw hats to keep the sun off their heads, and their clothes were dirty and sweaty. They stopped what they were doing when they saw the horseman coming, just like you would stop doing something at home to greet a guest. Thorne didn't bother with the usual niceties. He said in a strong voice that the community was upset, that rumors were threatening the peace of the county, and that he needed honest answers to questions he had been avoiding asking. Who were they really? What was their origin? Why did they decide to live so far away from everyone else? What did they do at night when the lights in their windows stayed on until dawn? And most importantly, what did they know about the travelers who had gone missing close by? Lily or Lucy answered. It was still hard to tell the difference. She dried her hands on her apron, took off her hat to show off her dark hair in a simple braid, and spoke in the same unsettling calm that she always used when talking to people in charge. They said their father was a professor who had died and left them a small inheritance that was enough to buy the land and live simply. They came from the East, from a town that wasn't worth mentioning because they had no ties or memories of the past. They chose to be alone because the world was mean to single women, especially those who looked the same and were treated like curiosities instead of people. The travelers didn't know anything more than what a local would know. People had been going missing in the Ozarks for a long time. The forest was big, the dangers were real, and not every trip went as planned. It was ridiculous at best, and insulting at worst to say that two women living alone could be responsible for such things. They were victims of bias, fear of the unknown, and the human need to find someone to blame when the real problem was just the cruel chance of life. Every argument was reasonable. Every explanation made sense, and every word was carefully chosen to put people at ease without giving away any important information. Thorne realized that he was being skillfully manipulated and led through a conversation that seemed helpful but didn't give him any real information. He changed his approach and asked if he could look around the property more, including the wooded areas where Robert had found those creepy crosses. The twins agreed right away, with a level of generosity that made people suspicious right away. People who had secrets to keep weren't as willing to let inspections happen, but those who knew their secrets were well hidden could act like they were helpful, even welcoming. Lucy, or was it Lily, said she would personally show them around the property and point out every building, corner, and piece of land that belonged to them. The walk took a long time. This time, they went back to the barn and looked at every loose board, pile of hay, and tool hanging on the walls. They looked through the henhouse, counting the birds, checking the nests, and looking for anything that didn't seem right. They looked around the cultivated fields, the vegetable garden, and the little orchard where young apple trees were starting to bear fruit. They finally got to the wooded area where they had seen the crosses. 7 rustic markers were still there, making that creepy semicircle. Without any shame, Lucy or Lily told us that those were the graves of animals that had died while they were taking care of them. They included chickens that had died from disease, a cat that had followed them from their old home and lived with them for a few months before dying of old age, and even a wounded deer they had tried to save but died during the night. They thought that all life, even the lives of simple creatures, should be honored, so they put up markers at each grave. The explanation was fine. A lot of people buried their pets with the same respect. It wasn't creepy, it was just a sensitivity that, while unusual, wasn't illegal. Thorne looked at the crosses and the ground around them to see if there was any sign that the graves held more than just animals. The ground was hard, covered in moss and fallen leaves, and it was clear that it hadn't been disturbed in months or even years. As the sun set, it painted the sky with orange and purple colors. They went home. Before the ride back, the twins gave them fresh water and a place to rest. Thorne agreed, feeling the weight of loss on his shoulders. He hadn't found anything. No proof, no leads, and no reason for the community's strong suspicions. He would have to go back to the village and say that, according to the law, the twins were completely innocent. Thorne had an experience that he could never fully explain while he was resting, drinking water, and watching the 2 identical women talk quietly by the window. It wasn't a dramatic revelation or a concrete discovery. It was just a deep and gut-level understanding that he was in the presence of something fundamentally different. It looked like normalcy on the outside, but on the inside it was something completely different. He watched them move. They weren't exactly in sync, but it was like they were dancing in a way that made it clear where the other person would be before they moved. He saw how they exchanged looks that spoke volumes, how they could communicate complicated things in less than a second without saying a word. And for a brief moment, when Lucy or Lily turned away from the light, he saw an expression on her face that didn't match the friendly mask she wore, a look of cold satisfaction, of planned victory, of someone who had just won a game whose rules only she knew completely. Thorne and his deputy rode off in silence, down the road as night fell on the Ozarks like a heavy, suffocating blanket. They didn't talk the whole way back. They couldn't put into words how they felt, how they knew without a doubt that they had just let something dangerous go free, not because it was innocent, but because it was too smart to be caught by the usual methods the law offered. Thorne had to deal with a worried crowd in the village that was waiting for news. He told the truth about the facts in a professional way. There was no proof of a crime, no reason to charge the twins, and no legal reason to take action against them. The words came out of his mouth like stones, heavy and cold. He could see the disappointment and anger on the faces around him turn into something more dangerous. The determination of those who had decided that if the law wouldn't act, they would have to. The stress in the months that followed made the village like a powder keg, ready to blow up at any moment. Thorne stepped up the patrols, keeping a close eye not only on the twins' property, but also on the people who were getting louder and louder about taking matters into their own hands. He knew enough about history to know that mobs driven by fear rarely stopped without feeling bad about what they had done, and he was determined to keep Webster County from having to deal with this kind of violence. The twins didn't seem to notice the growing hostility at all. They kept going to the village at the same times, buying things, saying hello to people in a cold way, and acting like nothing had changed. Some people saw this as real innocence, proof that they had nothing to be afraid of because they hadn't done anything wrong. Some people thought it was a deliberate provocation, an arrogant disregard for the fear they caused, and a show of power over a community that couldn't touch them without breaking its own laws. In September of that year, something unexpected happened that took the attention away from the twins for a while. A fire destroyed the barn of a family who lived several kilometers from Lily and Lucy's property. It killed 3 horses that couldn't be saved in time and destroyed the entire harvest. People in the community were already prone to conspiracy theories, so it didn't take long for someone to suggest that the twins might be involved, even though the cause of the fire was still unknown. By any reasonable standard, the accusation was ridiculous. There was no link between the twins and the family that was hurt, no reason for the attack, and no proof that they were near the scene. But reason had long since stopped controlling the way people thought. The fire was just one more thing on a long list of bad things that the twins were said to have brought to the area. People blamed them for crops that didn't grow. Animals got sick because of a curse that came from that property. People even blamed a drought that lasted longer than usual on their evil power. In October, a traveling preacher named Reverend Samuel came to the village and quickly saw the chance that the fear-filled atmosphere offered. He started giving fiery sermons about how important it was to get rid of evil influences from the land, and how letting evil live among good people was a way to invite everyone to hell. He never talked about the twins directly. Instead, he used vague language about dark forces and temptations that used people's faces to trick them. Thorne went to one of these sermons and saw that it was dangerous right away. Samuel was giving moral reasons for violence that a lot of people already wanted to do. He was turning fear into a religious duty and turning people who might have formed mobs into crusaders who thought they were doing God's will. After the sermon, Thorne talked to the Reverend in private and warned him about the consequences of inciting violence. He also reminded him that even preachers could be held responsible for the trouble their words caused. Samuel smiled in the way that religious men often do when they see people who follow the law. He said that he was just doing his spiritual duty, and that if the sheriff did his job right, there would be no need for divine intervention. He also said that when earthly authorities failed, people of faith had to act where angels feared to tread. The words were polite, but the message was clear. Samuel would not back down, and any attempt to silence him would only strengthen his story of religious persecution. The twins did something totally out of the blue that week. They asked Reverend Samuel to come see them. After one of his sermons, the invitation was made public in front of dozens of people. Lucy, or Lily, came up to him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said that they had heard about his spiritual concerns for the community. They said that as women of faith they understood how important moral purity was, and that they would like to talk to him about these things in private, away from the noise of the village. The invitation put Samuel in a tough spot. If you say no, you are admitting that you are a coward. To agree would mean going into the territory of the people he had been secretly demonizing. The crowd held their breath as they waited for his answer. Samuel had to choose between his pride and his survival. He chose pride. He accepted the invitation with a lot of bravado, saying that a man of God didn't fear the dark because he had light in his heart. The visit was set for noon the next day, in the middle of the day, and Samuel promised to be back before nightfall. Thorne offered to go with him, but the Reverend said no, saying that this would be a sign of weakness, and that his faith was strong enough to protect him from any evil he might face. Many people wanted to go with him, making the visit a kind of delegation, but Samuel turned them all down. He would go by himself, show that there was nothing to be afraid of, and come back with the truth that would put an end to all the rumors. Samuel rode toward the twins' property the next morning with the confidence of someone who really believed God was protecting him. Before he left, dozens of people heard him say that he would come back with answers before sunset. Thorn watched from a distance, and a heavy feeling of dread settled in his stomach like a stone in still water. The hours went by so slowly that it hurt. The time of day came and went. The afternoon dragged on until it was almost dark. People started to gather near the road that led back from the twins' house. They were all looking at the horizon with anxious eyes, waiting to see Samuel's familiar figure on horseback. The sun touched the mountains in the distance and painted the sky with a red that looked more like a warning than a sign of beauty. Samuel did not come back. When the sun went down completely, the crowd had grown to include almost all of the villagers. People started to talk in low, nervous whispers about what might have happened. These guesses quickly turned into unfounded certainties. Some people suggested making a search party right away. Some people said they should wait until morning. Some people, who were getting less and less attention, said that maybe Samuel had just decided to stay longer, that he was having a long and productive conversation, and that he would show up at any moment with perfectly reasonable explanations. Thorn knew he had to do something before things got out of hand. He called his deputy and 5 other men he trusted to stay calm when things got tough. They all got on their horses and lit lanterns to get ready to ride to the twins' house in the dim light of a crescent moon. Before they left, Thorn made sure the crowd promised to stay in the village, not do anything stupid, and let the law take its course. Thorn knew that the promises were too easy to make, and he knew that they wouldn't be kept if he didn't bring Samuel back safe and sound. He got on his horse and led the group out of the village. The lantern swayed with the movement, making the road they knew look strange and scary. The forest around them seemed to be watching them with a predatory gaze, each tree a silent guard watching them as they traveled toward answers that might be better left unknown. The twins' estate emerged from the dark like a lone island of light. Candles glowed in the windows, smoke drifted from the chimney, and the calmness felt out of place, given the urgency driving Thorn and his men. They dismounted at a respectful distance, tied their horses, and approached with lanterns raised, hands near, but not on their weapons. The door opened before they could knock. Lily stood in the doorway, holding a candle that lit up her face from below. The shadows made her features hard to see. She wasn't surprised to see the sheriff and 6 armed men on her property in the middle of the night. Instead, she tilted her head a little, as if to say, "Welcome to dinner," to guests who had been expected for weeks. Thorn got right to the point. Where was Reverend Samuel? Lily's answer came with that unsettling calm that had become her trademark. Samuel had gone hours ago, right after tea in the afternoon. They had a polite talk about faith, morals, and the problems that come with living in small towns where outsiders are always looked at with suspicion. He seemed happy with the answers he got, thanked them for their hospitality, and got on his horse, promising to come back to the village before nightfall. The explanation made sense, but it brought up an obvious question. If Samuel had left hours ago, why hadn't he gotten to the village, which was only an hour's ride away? Lily shrugged with careful grace. It was dangerous to drive on the road at night. Maybe his horse had tripped. Maybe he had chosen to take a different route. Maybe he stopped to think about nature or pray alone. She couldn't be held responsible for what a grown man did after he left her property. When Thorn asked to search the area again, the people there were more than happy to help, which always made him more suspicious than reassured. Lucy came out to the porch and looked just like her sister, even though the lanterns were shining directly on her. Both offered to help look for the missing person, but Thorn said no and told them to stay in the house while he and his men searched the property. The search didn't find anything at all. The twins' animals were the only ones in the stable. There was no sign of Samuel's horse, and the two women were the only ones who said he had been there recently. The barn was quiet, and the garden was still. The forest around them was so dark that their lanterns could barely see through it. They found the animal graveyard again. The 7 crosses were still in a creepy semicircle, but there was no sign that new graves had been added. Thorne called his men together after 2 hours of looking for something that wasn't there. Some said they should search the house thoroughly, even tearing up the floorboards if they had to find hidden cellars or secret compartments. Some people said that they should keep the twins in custody until they found Samuel, but Thorne knew that none of these things were legal for him to do. There was no proof of a crime, just an absence that could have many innocent reasons for it. They left at dawn, feeling defeated and angry. The twins watched from the balcony with looks that could be interpreted as real worry or poorly hidden amusement. The morning light made the road look very clear, and they drove slowly down it, looking for signs of an accident or a fight on either side. They found Samuel's horse halfway between the property and the village, calmly grazing by the road. The saddle was still on the horse, but there was no sign of its rider. Finding the abandoned horse made a lot of people sure of what they had been thinking. Samuel wouldn't leave his horse on purpose. Something had happened that was bad enough to make him leave his means of transportation, and the fact that the horse was so close to the twins' property couldn't be a coincidence. When Thorne came back to the village with only the horse that didn't belong to anyone, the crowd that was waiting for him didn't need to say anything to know that their worst fears had come true. The next few days saw more thorough searches. People from nearby counties volunteered to help search miles of forest, look into ravines and caves, and dredge the shallow parts of the river that ran through the area. They didn't find anything. No body, no ripped clothes, and no signs of violence. It was as if Reverend Samuel had never existed. He had disappeared like mist between the twins' house and the village. The lack of a body made things very difficult legally. There was no homicide to look into because there was no solid proof of death. There was no reason to bring charges because there were no witnesses. There was no reason to make arrests without physical evidence. Thorne was in a tough spot because the community wanted justice but didn't have the legal tools to get it. The twins went about their business as usual, though. They went to the village, did their shopping, and took care of their property with the same care they always do. But their behavior had changed. Before, they had been polite but cold. Now, they were openly defiant. They didn't say they were sorry or hide. They walked down the main street with their heads held high, meeting the angry looks with calmness, as if to say, "Prove it if you can." Another event shook the already weak community in November. A woman who lived alone on the edge of the village said she saw 2 identical figures standing in the trees at night, watching her house without moving, like statues. They didn't make any threatening movements. When she turned on a flashlight to see better, the figures were gone, as if they had never been there. Others started to tell similar stories. One farmer said he saw the twins on his land at dusk, but when he looked the next day, there were no footprints or other signs of them being there. On a moonless night, a whole family said they heard beautiful singing coming from all around their house at once. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping them in a beautiful and scary sound. Thorne looked into each story and always found the same thing. No physical proof, just scared people saying they saw shadows where there were only branches moving in the wind. He started to think that the group's fear had turned into a kind of shared hysteria, where every noise at night seemed like a threat and every shadow seemed like a bad person. But he also couldn't completely deny what people said. Many of them were sober and trustworthy people who didn't make things up or blow things out of proportion. Even though he couldn't fully explain it, a pattern was starting to form. The twins were always at the center of the stories, even when it wasn't clear if they were really there. It was as if they had become more of a symbol than real people. a representation of the primal fear that everyone had about the unknown that refused to be understood. That year, winter came early, bringing freezing temperatures and snow that kept the area cut off for weeks. During those white and quiet months, it seemed like there was an unspoken truce. The twins stayed on their land, and the villagers stayed in their homes. There were miles of snow-covered forest between them, which made it almost impossible for either side to move. But everyone knew that the truce wouldn't last long. When the ice melted in the spring and the roads became usable again, something would have to happen. The situation couldn't go on like this forever. A community couldn't stay scared all the time, and two women couldn't keep living as outcasts in a place where hostility was growing. Someone would have to do something, and when that happened, the fragile balance that had kept the peace would be broken. The thaw that came in the spring of 1912 seemed to bring not only the promise of new beginnings, but also the weight of resolutions that had been put off. The roads became rivers of mud, but they finally dried out under the stronger April sun. With them came the freedom of movement that both the residents and the twins had lost during the months of forced isolation. During this time of change, something unexpected happened. Lucy and Lily started coming to the village so often that it seemed like they were doing it on purpose. They didn't just shop like they usually did. They also stopped to talk, joined in conversations about the weather and the harvests, and even gave tips on how to garden that they had learned over the years they had been alone. It seemed like they were trying to fit in with the community for the first time since they got there. The change in behavior made people even more divided. Some people thought it was proof of innocence, that the women were really trying to connect with their neighbors who had unfairly judged them. Some people saw it as a planned way to manipulate people, an attempt to avoid suspicion by pretending to be charming while still doing whatever bad things they did at night when they were alone. Thorne became more and more worried as these things happened. He had spent the winter going over every little thing that had happened in the past, looking for patterns that he might have missed and trying to make connections that shouldn't have been made. The more he thought about it, the more sure he became that he was dealing with something that was beyond what he had seen as a rural county sheriff. It wasn't necessarily something supernatural, but it was certainly something very complicated in terms of psychology. In May, a traveler named Marcus came from the south to the village with news that everyone quickly found interesting. He said that a similar thing had happened years before in a county 3 days' travel away. 2 sisters lived alone, with rumors and suspicions all around them, and were accused of being involved in disappearances that were never solved. In the end, the sisters left in the middle of the night, leaving their things behind, and were never seen in that area again. Marcus's description of the sisters was vague, but close enough to make people wonder if they were the same people. Were Lily and Lucy really on the run from somewhere else, following a pattern they had already set? The theory spread quickly, getting more complicated with each time it was told. What started as a possibility became an unproven fact. Thorne wanted to talk to Marcus in more depth to get concrete, verifiable information, but the traveler admitted that his story was mostly based on rumors he had heard himself, that he had never met the sisters in person, and that he couldn't swear to any real connection with Lily and Lucy beyond superficial coincidences. It was another dead end, another lead that fell apart when looked at closely. But Marcus's story brought back to life the flames that winter had put out for a while. Men started to meet in barns and private homes to talk about what to do about the twins' problem. Thorne knew about these meetings, but he couldn't stop them from happening. Within the law, people had the right to meet, voice their concerns, and talk about solutions. The issue was that these lines were getting harder and harder to see in people's minds. Some people said that the twins should be formally kicked out, which would mean that they would have to sell their property and leave the county. Others suggested that the property be watched all the time, with shifts of men watching it day and night until the twins made a mistake that showed who they really were. and there were more and more people who talked about more permanent solutions that didn't involve going through the courts. In this tense situation, Lucy and Lily made their biggest move by inviting everyone in the village to dinner at their estate. The invitation was made public after a church service on Sunday. Lucy climbed the church steps and announced in a voice that could be heard all over the courtyard that they wanted to show their good faith, prove they had nothing to hide, and celebrate the arrival of spring with their neighbors as a way to make up. People were shocked and silent when they heard the proposal. No one expected such boldness or such a complete change from the twins' years of being alone. The invitation made things hard for the community. If you accept, you might be walking into a trap. If they said no, it would mean admitting that their fears were not based on real proof, but on irrational fear. Thorne quickly stepped in and said that if something like that were to happen, it should happen during the day, in broad daylight, in an open area where everyone could see and be seen, and with him there as a representative of the law to make sure everything went smoothly. Lucy quickly agreed to all of the terms and suggested that they meet the next Saturday at noon, with tables set up in the front garden where there was plenty of room and full visibility. During the week before the dinner, there were heated arguments about who should go and who should stay away from the event altogether. Families fought with each other, and friends disagreed about whether the choice was smart. Some people thought the dinner would be a good chance to finally see the twins in a less controlled setting, maybe catching a revealing mistake. Some people were afraid it was a complicated trap, but no one could explain how a trap could be set up in broad daylight with dozens of witnesses. The sky was clear and blue on Saturday morning, and a light breeze brought the smell of wildflowers. The twins had carefully set up the property, with long tables in parallel rows, spotless white tablecloths, and simple but beautiful arrangements of wildflowers as decoration. The smell of roast meat and fresh bread filled the air as the food was being cooked on wood-burning stoves set up outside. About 40 people came, including some who were just interested, some who were doubtful, and some who really hoped that the event would lead to better relationships in the community. Thorne was there with his second-in-command, who was positioned in a way that they could see everything without looking threatening. The conversation started out tense and formal, but as the food got better and the hostesses were so nice, they slowly became more normal. Lily and Lucy moved around the guests with ease, serving food and drinks and talking about simple things like recipes and how to preserve food. They laughed at the right times, were genuinely interested in other people's lives, and did all the things that good hostesses should do. And little by little, Thorne began to understand that the impossible was happening. People were starting to like them. It was at this very relaxed time, when the guards had let their guard down and suspicion was starting to fade, that something happened that would change everything. Martha, a woman who may have had one too many glasses of homemade wine, got up to go to the bathroom and asked for directions. Lucy said she would show her the way to the house, and they left together while the conversations at the garden tables continued to be lively. Martha came back 15 minutes later with a look on her face that had gone through all the colors of emotion and settled on something between fear and confusion. She walked up to Thorne with shaky steps and whispered something in his ear that made the sheriff tense up right away. He took her away from the crowd and behind one of the parked wagons where they could talk without everyone hearing them. What Martha saw inside the house would finally break through the wall of guesswork and turn doubts into something much more real and impossible to ignore. Martha shook as she talked about what she had seen. Her words came out in gasps, and she had to take deep breaths to try to organize her thoughts, which seemed to refuse to follow any kind of logical order. She said that Lucy had led her through the house to a hallway that led to the bathroom in the back. On the way, a half-open door had shown Martha a room she would never forget. What bothered her wasn't what was in the room, but what the room stood for. There were detailed maps of the area on the walls, with tiny handwriting notes and markings that Martha couldn't fully read. But what really caught her eye were the small, personal items on the carefully arranged shelves: a pocket watch, an embroidered handkerchief, a pair of glasses, a silver brooch, and a small Bible with initials carved into the cover. Some of these things were familiar to Martha. The watch used to belong to Harold Brennan, the merchant whose accident was never fully explained. The wife of one of the missing travelers had talked about the handkerchief. Reverend Samuel's initials were carved in gold letters on the worn leather cover of the small Bible. "They were trophies," Martha whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "They were things that reminded me of people who never came back." Thorne's stomach felt tight. Finally, after months of frustration and dead ends, there was something real that linked the twins to the disappearances in a way that was hard to explain. He had to do something right away, but he also had to do it right. One wrong move now could put any future legal action in danger. He told Martha to stay calm and not tell anyone anything yet. Then, with the determination that came from finally having a good reason for what he was doing, he walked up to where Lily was talking to a group of guests. He asked to talk to her and her sister alone, away from the other guests. In a low but firm voice, Thorne saw a hint of something real in Lily's face for the first time since meeting the twins. It must have been something in his tone that made her understand how serious the situation was. It wasn't quite fear, but maybe it was the realization that the game had finally reached its most important point. Thorne told Lucy that she needed to do a more thorough inspection of the house based on new information she had just received. The twins didn't ask what the information was, and they didn't seem surprised or angry. Instead, they gave each other one of those looks that said a lot without saying anything, and then Lily told them they could look anywhere they wanted. It was strange how calmly they accepted the search. Normally, innocent people would protest, ask for explanations, and stand up for their rights, but the twins just walked away and went back to the guests, acting like nothing unusual was happening. They kept serving food and talking lightly while the sheriff and his deputy entered the house. Martha showed them the room she had seen. The door, which had been open, was now completely closed. Thorne opened it with a shaking hand, ready to face the proof that would finally make sense of all the months of frustrating investigation. He found a room that was completely empty. There were no maps or markings on the walls. The shelves that Martha said she had seen were empty. There was no Bible, no clock, no handkerchief or glasses. There was only a simple bed, an empty wooden chest with some folded clothes in it, and a window that looked out on the forest behind the house. It was a completely normal room, with nothing in it that could be seen as suspicious. Martha looked around with a look of complete confusion. She kept saying that the things were there, and that she had seen them with her own eyes just a few minutes before. But Thorne knew how that would sound, especially since Martha had already said she had been drinking wine. It would look just like what the twins had always said: a lot of people going crazy because of fear and imagination. They carefully searched the rest of the house for hidden compartments, spaces under floorboards, and any other places where things could have been quickly hidden. They didn't find anything. The house was just like Thorne remembered it from past visits: clean, tidy, and completely normal in every way. The twins were waiting on the porch when they got back. Lily politely asked if they had found what they were looking for. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite victory, but maybe the satisfaction of someone who had seen this coming. Thorne didn't say anything. He just took Martha and her deputy away from the property. The mood had changed, but dinner went on without them. The guests could tell that something had happened, but they didn't know what it was. People started to leave, thanking them for their hospitality, but clearly not wanting to stay any longer. Conversations turned into whispers. The twins were the only ones left an hour later, cleaning up and putting away food as if they had just hosted a great party. Most people in the village didn't believe Martha's story. How could the things have gone missing so quickly? Why would the twins let her see something that could get them in trouble? Wasn't it more likely that she just made it up because of the wine and the stories everyone had been telling for months? Even people who wanted to believe her had a hard time making sense of what she said when they saw that the room was completely empty. But Thorne couldn't just ignore the testimony. He had known Martha for years and knew she was a smart and honest person. The twins' reaction, how easily they accepted the search, made him think they knew exactly how it would all play out. They had thought about the chance of being found out, and had come up with a way to respond that would make them look even more innocent, and like victims of unfair persecution. In the days that followed, the split in the community grew deeper until it became an unbridgeable gap. One side thought the dinner incident was the last piece of evidence that the twins were dangerous manipulators who had set up the whole thing to make their accusers look bad. The other side thought it proved that the twins' whole relationship was based on paranoia and fantasy, and that innocent women were being persecuted by a community that couldn't accept differences. The twins went on with their lives as if nothing had happened, but something had changed at a deep level. Before, they had kept their distance out of respect, but now they seemed to be everywhere. People saw them every day in the village. They took part in community events and helped their neighbors with hard tasks. It was as if they had decided that the best way to protect themselves was to be completely open and involved in the community so that any action against them would be seen as an attack on the village itself. Thorne would rather not admit that the plan worked better than he thought it would. The twins got more fans with each nice thing they did. Every act of kindness made people feel grateful, which made stories of evil more complicated. They were slowly and steadily becoming accepted members of the community instead of outcasts. They turned suspicion into sympathy through patience and manipulation that was so subtle that few people noticed they were being manipulated. Thorne felt more and more defeated as he watched all of this. He lost, not in a dramatic fight or through a complicated legal twist, but just because the twins were better at playing the social game than he had thought they would be. They had turned every accusation into proof of their innocence, and every investigation into proof of unfair persecution. Now, with the support of a large part of the village, they were almost untouchable. Thorne knew one last thing that kept him up at night. People who keep secrets so well eventually mess up. He needed patience, not strength, and he was willing to wait as long as it took for the masks Lily and Lucy wore so well to finally slip, showing what was really behind those identical eyes and planned smiles. In the months that followed, Webster County became strangely quiet, as if the land itself had decided to hold off on judging the twins and let time reveal its truths at the right time. During the summer, there were a lot of warm days when people worked in the fields instead of thinking about Lily and Lucy. Life went back to normal, with harvests and festivals, weddings and births, and the same old cycles that have ruled rural communities for as long as anyone can remember. The twins stayed on the land they had made their own, taking care of their gardens and animals. They lived on the outskirts of the village, where things had become almost comfortable because they were so predictable. They were never fully accepted or fully rejected. They were in between, neither inside nor outside, and they were both observers and observed. Thorne got older during those years, and the weight of unsolved mysteries left lines on his face that weren't there when the twins first came. He never completely stopped watching them or paying attention to the patterns that only he seemed to see. But the urgency had faded. He was now patiently watching, having learned that some truths only come out when they are ready, not when they are forced. When Thorne was patrolling the road that ran by the twins' property by himself, he would sometimes stop and look at the house among the trees and wonder what had really happened there. He would wonder how many of the stories were true and how many were made up by a group of people who were afraid of the unknown. He would never find a clear answer, and over time he learned to deal with this uncertainty, just like everyone else does when they have questions that don't have clear answers. Like all communities, the village changed over time. People left to look for work in bigger cities. New families came, bringing with them new ideas that weren't tainted by the past. Lily and Lucy were just two women living alone to these newcomers. They might have been strange, but they weren't any more scary than any other hermit who chose to live alone. And what about the twins? They stayed the same as they had always been. A mystery wrapped in careful behavior, perfect copies of each other, keeping secrets that could be terrible or completely normal. The truth about Lily and Lucy was still as hard to pin down as ever. It changed shape depending on who told the story, and over time it turned from fact into legend. There are stories that the Ozarks keep in their old forests, whispered among trees that have seen generations of people come and go like seasons. These stories are about what lives in the space between certainty and doubt, how evil can look like normalcy, or how fear can turn innocence into a monster through the power of collective belief. The story of the twins is one of these stories. It exists in the space where reality and legend meet and become something that is both and neither at the same time. The mountains don't give up their secrets easily. They keep secrets in deep ravines and hidden caves, in old cemeteries that have been covered in leaves for years, and in abandoned homes where nature is slowly taking back what people used to own. Today, if you walked through those lands, you would hear only silence and be alone, with only the wind moving the branches and the water running over the old stones. But if you listened closely, you might hear echoes of a story that was never fully told, bits of truths that won't go away even when people forget them. Voices in harmony singing melodies that aren't from any known hymn, two identical figures walking along roads that don't exist anymore, laughter that could be wind or something that used to be human, and celebrating victories that no one remembers anymore. There are a lot of stories like this in the Ozarks. They live on the line between what was and what could have been, between fact and fiction. And maybe this uncertainty is more accurate than any clear answer could be, because in the end, what matters is not whether Lily and Lucy were monsters or victims, guilty or innocent, but what their story shows us about ourselves, how we handle differences, and how fear and fascination can exist together in a dance that never really ends.